Hello and warm welcome to the Sheltering Places program at the new Center for Research and Practice. My name is Mark and my co-host is Alex Cruse. Today we are having a special session devoted to Belarus. Belarus used to be favorite examples of researchers of post-Soviet coloniality as a country with non-protesting, non-critical, non-subjective population, described as locals, as between Stalin and Hitler. Belarusians were the eternal victims of circumstances and great history. The events of the recent months have run contrary to these old ideas about Belarus while exposing previously unnoticed and unique dynamics of identity and nation formation. Today's conversation aims to address this unfolding transformation, which does not have a ready-made historical interpretation, but is being reformulated along the new and emerging narrative lines. Today we have amazing guests and great experts. I want to introduce and welcome Elena Gapova, a professor at the Department of Sociology, Western Michigan University. She is an editorial board member of Slavic Review, an editorial board member of Aspasia, the International Yearbook of Central Eastern and Southeastern European Women's and Gender History, an academic board member for Politics and Society After Chernobyl, a board member of International Association for Humanities. She is a founder of the Center for Gender Studies at European Humanities University. She writes extensively about nation building, gender, class, and intellectuals in Belarus and post-Soviet region. Her works had a huge impact on Belarusian intellectual tradition. I would like to welcome Dr. Sasha Razor. She is an alumna in Department of Slavic, Eastern European, and Eurasian Studies. In June 2020, she completed her dissertation titled "We Were the River, Screenwriters of the Left Front of the Arts in 1923 and 1931. Beside the avant-garde cinema and literature, her research interest focuses on Belarus in Ukrainian literature and culture, post-colonialism, visual arts, diasporic and women's studies. In 2020, Sasha Razor received an internship grant and completed her internship at the Museum of Russian Culture in San Francisco. She currently curated a remarkable history of Belarusian Vyzhyvanka exhibition. And Grigory Ioffe, a professor of geography at Radford University. He's been active in Belarusian studies since 2002. He has authored and co-authored multiple peer-reviewed articles on Belarus, including geostrategic interest and democracy promotion, evidence from the post-Soviet space, in Europe-Asia studies, debating Belarus and economy in comparative perspective, in Eurasian geography and economics, as well as Belarusian and the West, Belarus and the West, from estrangement to honeymoon, in the Journal of Communist Studies and Transition Politics. Published in 2014, his book Reassessing Lukashenko, Belarus in Cultural and Geopolitical Context, is based on extensive interviews with Lukashenko. Professor Ioffe regularly writes about Belarus for Eurasia Daily Monitor. And again, warm welcome. It's a pleasure to put this panel together. So Belarus was often used as an example of a country without subjectivity, this non-protesting, non-critical victim of circumstances. The mobilization of society against the falsified elections in 2020 ran contrary to these visions. It marked a shift of Belarusians from the passive objects of history to the subject that has the power to define, decide, declare its own future. We are witnessing today is the dynamic reconceptualization of the meaning of Belarusianness, the redefinition of what it means to be Belarusian. In today's discussion, we will attempt to look at these ongoing processes. We are going to think about Belarusian subject, its qualities and characteristics, as well as what is this knowledge about Belarusian subject exposed to us that has been hidden or unseen or unnoticed before. What is this, the end of silence, the end of absence? And I'd like to direct the first question to Elena Gapova. Do you think that past this, what Ushakin termed gestures of denial as signs of Belarusian subjectivity, past these systems of stylistic absence, systems of absence, we are now starting to see something beyond this mere denial and beyond this mere absence?
Audio.
Well, hello everyone. I'm not sure. I'm ready to discuss these ideas of Sergey Shkin in relation to what is going on in Belarus today. Well, it is known that he had these important works on Belarus, writing about this kind of lack of subjectivity. Well, of course, his argument is much more complicated than that, but definitely the process that is taking place in Belarus can be seen as the process of agency formation. And by agency, well, one can see one's volition to act independently and to make one's own free choices. And actually, well, this whole mobilization that we see in Belarus these days, well, it probably can be described, these activities that they have this mundane everyday character. They sustain identity formation. Protesters as one of those protesters, people participating in protest, put it on Facebook several months ago. The old opposition, meaning the opposition that has existed in Belarus for several decades now and who claimed nation building, human rights, and well, all the corrupt things. They were trying, she writes, they were trying to give us back, to give us human rights, to give us back our rights. But the new opposition, and by the new opposition, she means, well, what has started in the summer of 2020. But the new opposition gave us back to ourselves, meaning that they came and said, you know what you need to do, go and do it. Meaning that, well, you are active in the expression of your protest. You are free in choosing the form of engagement. Just be yourself, and by yourself, they mean, well, the way they want to be. They want to see themselves. So, and all this campaigning, all this mobilization, while campaigning for political prisoners, collecting money for the persecuted, turning residential areas into agoras where poets, musicians, and intellectuals used to perform throughout the autumn, but it was stopped with the use of force now. All those subversive graffitis that still pop up here and there, hanging up protest flags, well, all kinds of this expression of protest. They have this mundane everyday character. Every day you live your life by protesting, by doing something, by wearing subversive colors. Well, this relates definitely to identity formation. And protesters stress that they do what they do exclusively of their own volition. Well, this is what we call agency in social science, in political science, agency, and sometimes political subjectivity or citizenship. And citizenship, of course, it's not about having a national passport, but it's about the status of a person in her political and legal relationship to the state. It's about being able to confront the state. So citizenship, it implies autonomy, and well, so definitely this process is in process these days in Belarus.
Up to the moment that there is quite a long history of these attempts to search for Belarusian agency and to articulate it. They never stopped, and the search for this, for what it means to be Belarusian, for this, somebody would say, mythical, true Belarusianness, it took different forms, but quite often it would stumble when confronted with the heavy heritage, heavy colonial heritage of these intensive colonization processes emanating from both West and the East. And but do you see any change in the dynamics, Sasha, that the protests marked, for example?
Hi. So in the very beginning, you referred to the study by Sergey Shkin, and I suspect that you meant his article about Khatyn and Karapaty sites. Am I correct?
Yes.
And you see, Sergey Shkin's argument in that article in particular has something to do with the commemorative rituals of memory formation. So the colonial and the way that the post-colonial subjectivity is being constructed in Belarus. And to just reinstate what he says in this article, his main critique is that people see themselves as victims of history, and this is where the agency gets lost. And he's highly critical of this framework and paradigm himself. But this is not to say that the subject or subjectivity of the Belarusians or the identity were not there. And in fact, I can refer to other studies by a wonderful historian, Simon Lewis, who just recently wrote a book about Belarusian identity on Nelly Becker's 10 years ago. So there were always these attempts to construct Belarusianness and to negotiate it since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we do have a very multifaceted paradigms of identity at work that are not necessarily competing with each other, but coexist. And the landscape is rather diverse. And of course, with the beginning of the protest, all these processes accelerated and came to the fore because, as Elena Gapova rightfully pointed out, we are dealing with the construction of the civic nationalism and with many redefinitions of what being a Belarusian means. And indeed, right now we see many of these definitions flowing in the social media. And to some people, being Belarusian means that you take off your shoes before you climb on a bench when you protest. And to other people, being Belarusian means that when you need to help out, you are the person to show the most solidarity. And like that one person in Poland even pushed the bus on the street. You know, this is what Belarusians are. A little bit before that, we had a definition of Belarusians articulated on a TV show by Yuri Dud. Those were one of the tech people in the Silicon Valley. Mikita Makada said, well, Belarusian means Russian, but with a sign of quality, which is ridiculous to me. But we do have all these ideas circulating right now. Again, once the protest moves to a different phase and we'll be facing the new reality, all these competing definitions will debate, and we will be left with constructing a very solid foundation for what it means to be a citizen. And how can ordinary citizens participate in making a just society or to strive for social justice? So I don't know if I'm answering your questions, but of course this process is accelerated, and with the digital citizenship, we have new definitions coming up, but again, we're just the observers in this process.
The guiding direction in an attempt to find this this Belarusian identity in Belarusian studies, at least, was often the attempt to articulate the break with colonial experience guided by the post-colonial studies borrowed from the Western academia. It was that in order to see what is Belarusian agency, what's Belarusian subject, we need to articulate this break from the colonial experience. And oftentimes this refers to the USSR colonial experience. And thinking about the protest, Grigory, this question maybe for you. Do you think that Belarusian state would see itself as the heir of the BSSR, or the heir of the USSR, and this is how it would position itself?
Well, it's a difficult question to address. So far, we've been available for this discussion for like a quarter of an hour, and the most frequently uttered adjectives have been colonial and post-colonial. I am certainly familiar with connotations of these adjectives, and I've come across them in some texts, including in the Simon Lewis's recent publication. And to me, from the perspective of what I know, have been researching, focusing on Belarus, including some first-hand experiences since the mid-1960s, because I've been traveling to Minsk periodically since 1964. These adjectives come across to me as certain mature cliches that people are attached to, that some scholars are attached to. But as long as the majority of people living in Belarus itself do not consider their Soviet experience as colonial, or maybe a longer experience within the Russian Empire as colonial, these constructs, these adjectives don't seem to ring the bell. They rather obfuscate the situation. They do not clarify it, because we can, there is no taboo on using any any kind of adjectives. We are free to use all of them. But I'm wondering whether they are, kind of highlighting, elucidating something, or rather obscuring something. It seems to me that the Soviet period was the longest period in the Belarusians' self-conscious existence. It was a formative period. Even the self-name Belarusians was first internalized by the majority of people living in Belarus during the Soviet period. Therefore, sort of imagining that we can delete this period from this common experience and reflecting on it just simply because we have decided that it used to be alien to some kind of Belarusianness or how we see it. I don't think that this is going to resolve any problems. Therefore, the Soviet legacy, with all evil and not so evil aspects, is sort of it's a formative period for Belarusians as a community. Obviously, everybody's identity has been constructed in such a way. The fact that, for example, Poles and Russians came up with more or less a clear-cut identity before Belarusians did doesn't make them any more deserving of their own essential identity. But it's a historical fact that for a long time, Belarusians lived between these two well-established cores. And as, what's the name of this linguist from the Belarusian state? Michkovskaya, yes. Her writings are usually underestimated because she is not politicized and she doesn't want to participate in those debates. But her, books about the Belarusian language, about Belarusian identity are superb. And she wrote in that book of hers that was published in Germany with a Russian title, but German publishing house, that for a long time anything that was elevated or used to be elevated above the illiterate peasant existence was either Russian and Orthodox or Polish and Catholic. And so Belarusians used to be a kind of a, what Anthony David Smith called demotic ethne, so an ethnic group devoid of upper classes. And that used to be a historical fact for a long time. Only during the Soviet period that began to change. That's why I would like to repeat that however enlightened these subjects, I mean, these adjectives, colonial and post-colonial, may sound, or they may be dear to our ear, music to our ear, but they don't seem to convey anything substantive about Belarus. The Soviet period, at least in the foreseeable future, will remain the formative period for the Belarusians as an ethnic community, as a national community, and a lack of recognition of that is actually a dead end. It's not going to lead us anywhere. So we need to embrace this formative period to the extent Belarusians themselves embrace it. Some willingly, some unwillingly, some like it, some dislike it, but so what?
Thank you very much. You touched upon this really interesting topic, because even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Belarusians are reported to have a more pronounced Belarusian Soviet identity than Belarusian ethnocultural one. And moreover, we have this consistent neo-Soviet position of the Belarusian government that not only preserved and sustained the Soviet heritage, but also continued working within this specific discourse. And as Sasha said a little bit earlier, that we now have these two identities, the Belarusian Soviet one and Belarusian ethnocultural one, that are not necessarily in competition. And I want to bring in here a very interesting observation by Elena Gapova, where she said that Belarus was really a beneficiary of, for example, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and therefore it connects Belarus with the criminal actions of the Soviet. And this suggests that it's very problematic and difficult to externalize the Soviet experience from the Belarusian experience. Can you maybe, Elena, comment on this?
Well, it was in a paper and it was said in a context, of course. I was invited to contribute to an issue of Новое литературное обозрение, a Moscow-based academic journal on post-coloniality, and there were submissions. It's published now, and there were submissions from all these former republics and now independent nations of the Soviet independent nations, of course. And when thinking about, well, what to write, what to say about Belarus, and I think there were other people who published on Belarus in that issue, not just I decided that it would be interesting to look at this phenomenon of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. On the one hand, it was condemned by in 1989 by this, well, what was it called? Первый съезд народных депутатов, this Congress of People's Deputies at the end of the year. Well, so it was condemned as an act of aggression against an independent state, etc. But then it's interesting to look at those claims, at those things from inside the communities which are in the center. Interestingly, well, this pact was signed in 1939, and then in September the 17th, the Soviet army crossed this border of Western Belarus, and so that's how Belarusians got half of its contemporary territory. And interestingly, so every year, somewhere in September, Belarusian independent media write about the pact. And well, this is an ambivalent position. On the one hand, they all condemn the pact. On the other hand, this issue of having one half of Belarus now being within national borders is not even discussed, is not questioned, because it is a fact. And it is a nation as well. We were born into this nation, we grew up in this nation, and we take the nation within these borders as a we to which we belong. So, well, this conversation, and I remember well how at some point, and I have it in my paper, that at some point Lukashenko said that we need to erect a golden statue to Comrade Stalin, who gave us a half of our country. So of course it's very ironic, but well, that's the irony. That's the irony of history. And well, it's interesting to see how well this discussion of this half of territory, which after the Treaty of 1918 and then the Riga Treaty of 1921, this well called Western Belarus, it was incorporated into Poland, and at that time this discourse of reunification in this interwar period, it was run under the it was driven by the idea of reuniting the oppressed, our oppressed brother with our oppressed brothers from the bourgeois Poland. Poland in that discourse used to be bourgeois. And so, well, Belarusian workers and especially Belarusian peasants in the countryside are oppressed by the Polish pani, by the Polish landlords. So it was this class character. And now, and that was in our school textbooks when I was growing up in the 1970s and in the 80s, and throughout all those years, this discourse during the Soviet times, this discourse of reunification with our oppressed brothers, so it had class overtones. And then in the, well, after independence and, well, after, well, at some point, probably for the last couple of decades, this discourse has been driven by the idea of coloniality, post-coloniality, all those issues that you are, well, raising up in this discussion. Now, this issue of our oppressed working brothers is gone, but now it's the reunification of the Belarusian nation within its national borders or within its ethnic borders or within its historical borders, whatever. So it's interesting to see how this Marxist discourse, well, class-driven, the idea of all the oppressed people being united again in the Soviet Union and Belarus and having back this territory, how now it is substituted by the idea of colonial oppression, coloniality, post-coloniality, etc. And it is interesting how the colonial oppressor is now Russia and the Soviet Union. And at the same time, this half of territory was given back to Belarus during Soviet times by that very oppressor. So, well, it's an interesting play, which is interesting to look at intellectually. But I think that just most Belarusian people now take this territory for granted, and well, that's who we are. This issue of post-coloniality, just the way Grigory put it, it mostly interests intellectuals, people who write about it, who will think about it in these conceptual terms.
Some intellectuals.
What?
Some intellectuals.
Well, probably some intellectuals, yes.
And also,
well, because
I'm sorry, this idea about this shifting notion of who colonial master is, whether it's Poland or Russia, is in itself kind of flimsy. But there's also one other aspect, the purely demographic aspect, the demographic erosion of the countryside in eastern Belarus, predated by some 20 to 30 years. That, I mean, the demographic erosion of West Belarusian countryside. Up until relatively recently, Western Belarus was still in possession of vibrant rural communities, and so it generated a lot of migration to Minsk and other urban centers, whereas those demographic resources from the east have long been exhausted. And then they were shared between Minsk and Moscow and St. Petersburg and Smolensk and Pskov and so on and so forth. So in a way, Belarus of today, urban Belarus of today, has more of a West Belarusian background today. And to some extent, this, what you call the agency formation, the creation of these horizontal ties in what used to be an atomized society is what has been contributed by Western Belarus. Because human capital is largely there. So in terms of territory, it may be half, but in terms of demographic potential, until recently, Western Belarus that was simply not part of the Soviet Union during the most destructive and, self-destructive part of Soviet history up until 1939. It remained much more vivacious, alive in a way. And so I attribute quite a bit of what happened beginning on the 9th of August to the contribution of this West Belarusian ferment, demographically speaking.
Yes, and now we have, like in Belarusian studies, still this huge heritage of the attempts to find the oppressor. Is the Soviet Union? Is it Poles? And one of them is this famous example of Karapaty. But this reminds me of this statement of Pavel Yakubovich, who basically said that Karapaty is not a place to search for historical truths, but it was heavily used by the Russian researchers for exactly the purpose of delineating this division and bringing it back to the contemporary situation. The Karapaty were very prominent during the 2020s protest, and there were lots of parallels made between the events of the late 30s, early 40s, when Karapaty was the place of the mass shootings of the Belarusian intelligentsia, and the parallel was established to the events of 2020, 2021. But at the same time, discursively, the events of the 30s and 40s are portrayed to be an external invasion, while the recent events and the events of the protest are completely internal. And then can we really talk about this parallel? Maybe Sasha, would you like to reflect on this?
Thank you, Mark. So from what I know and talking to my friends who are historians, they're quite wary of the parallel established between the Karapaty and today's situations, because the historical situations and contexts are entirely different. And I think that we would have to agree that different disciplines approach the same material in a different way, because for a historian, there is no way you can draw this parallel. But again, I study culture, and all narratives that circulate in our culture tell us something about the mental predicament of people and what they're trying to say. And from cultural studies perspective, every statement made by protesters about Karapaty has its own value. So what was the question again?
Can we really draw the parallel between the events of the late 30s and early 40s and today? Because in the first instance, it is framed as something external, and nowadays we are talking completely about internal events.
So the parallels can only be drawn, as for me, like historical parallels absolutely know different periods and different situations. But when it comes to analyzing your own situation and your own predicament, we say Belarus now functions as if under the occupation. And the reason we say it because our grandmothers, our mothers in some cases, went through the occupation period, and there is memory. This is in the people's memory. We know these stories about living under the German occupation. But it's important to understand that Belarusian society produced Lukashism. It exists not without the aid of the Russian dictator, but still it exists on its own, and the structures of terror that are created on the Belarusian lands are something that the country created on its own. and the oppressors are internal, not external. So this is how I view the situation. But again, this is very general talk. It doesn't have any prescriptive kind of recommendations and so on and so forth. And I still see no limitations to working with this cultural material. Another thing which I think is quite interesting is how right now there is a movement to republish some of the Stalin's documents and legacies. And there was a recent collection called Nerastraliane. So people who were not shot, it's alternative narratives from the Stalin's times. And what I think is really interesting and telling is that the Belarusians crowdfunded publications, and then they published books, and information still remains closed. Because if this is so important for the protesters, that people learn about Stalinism and all these narratives, why don't they make this information public? Why don't they share it online so that anyone can download and read the historic narratives that came up in the archives, and why to safeguard this legacy once again? And this is something that I've been thinking about a lot. If they think that once we understand the heritage of Karapaty and what it means and how that violence came about, we can maybe solve around the situation, then all of this should be in public access. Thank you.
Thanks. The rationale for these attempts to sort of delineate what is really Belarusian, what is not, what has been brought from somewhere else, what has been oppressing the Belarusian agency, or these are all attempts that are now in the archive of Belarusian studies. They are oftentimes motivated by this overarching idea that in order to write our own history, we need to do this by means that are symbolically and ideologically owned by Belarusian agent. And this is why there are so many attempts to find this Belarusian agent, to find something that symbolically and ideologically is owned. But would you agree that we really need this understanding? We really need to write our own history by this means that are symbolically and ideologically owned by Belarusian individual and group subject, and how can we really find them?
And is this the question to me?
Yes,
okay.
Please.
So first things first, there is no such thing as ownership of the means. And reclaiming the language back doesn't mean that the language functions entirely as your own. I share a particular view on the function of the Belarusian language as heritage language, which undergoes periods of oblivion and then ethnic revitalization and functions as such. But I also think of the Belarusian territory as inherently multilingual. And then what are we to tell to other groups who spoke Polish or Yiddish on its territory? What are their means of ideological production? And if we are to reconstruct some of the agency, recover some of the narratives, why not to make it multi-ethnic? It is also important, even though Grigory doesn't like the word post-colonial, it is important to look at the experience of other countries that underwent decolonization. And I'm particularly well familiar with North African literature and the experience, for example. And as you might know, a large corpus of North African literature has been written in French, and their writers are excellent. It's a top-notch literature coming from Algiers and Morocco. And I'll be happy when Belarus gets to the time and place when we have just as strong literary traditions as those places have. And I know that all the language debates that took place in North Africa in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s yielded in a resolution announced by Algerian writer Asa Jabar, who said, well, we should stop arguing about what language we wrote this in. What about the message? What about what we have to say in the languages that we write? So my offer here is to stick to the variety of languages and stop being so hung up on articulating things in Belarusian, because Belarusian functions as a performative language. Every time that I choose to speak Belarusian, I indicate that I am with this group. I have mastery of the language, and I respect the Belarusian speakers.
Thank you. And Elena, I would like to hear your take on this, and in particular on, can we consider Russian language a sign of oppression? Can Belarusian agency dwell in Russian language, in your opinion?
Sorry, I'm just not sure if I understood you correctly, because, well, the voice is definitely somewhat.
Do you think that Russian language can be considered a tool of oppression in today's Belarus, or can Belarusian?
Mark, wow, really? Yes. Well, that's my well. Russian language is a fact in Belarus. This is what most people speak, and of course, well, this Sasha started this conversation about language and colonialism and the language of the oppressed, and well, these of course are these huge discourses, but Russian. Well, before the Soviet period, Belarusian was the language one of the ethnic groups within the Russian Empire, or, well, probably sometimes considered a dialect, sometimes, well, considered a language. It was claimed that, well, that was a language. So, and it is in these first decades of the Soviet period when Belarusian was lifted to the status of this national language, and it was even imposed on the population. And in the 1920s, for example, as we know from this research by the Swedish scholar Per Radling, sometimes, and it was introduced into academia. And by the way, academia, higher education was created in those days, and some of the intellectuals who were functional in other languages were actually against that. But then in the 1930s, industrialization starts all over the Soviet Union, and industrialization, it requires those elites and which can understand each other in different parts of the Soviet Union, and that's how, well, Russian becomes this language of upward social mobility, the language of education, etc. So it's a long story how languages interact and how they come into use and how they come out of use. But I must say that the Belarusian language, writing in the Belarusian language, for example, by Vasil Bykov, by Alisa Damovich, by Karapaty, their books had print runs that are just unimaginable in post-Soviet market economy. So, well, this situation of the interaction between languages is a complicated one, definitely, but saying that Russian is the language of the oppression, how come is if most people in Belarus speak it as their native language, and they express their discontent and their protest and their whatever in this language, which they take as their mother's tongue. So I'm, well, somewhat surprised by this assertion.
Yes, just wanted to hear your take on this. Maybe the phrasing of the question was wrong, but yes, thank you for this comment. I'd like, yeah, Grigory. So given that mutual coexistence of these identities and basically the impossibility to follow the Western model where in the footsteps of Spivak and Baba, we are trying to delineate what we consider colonial and oppressive from what we consider would be Belarusian in this sense. Given that we live in a country that sees itself on the governmental level as the direct heir of the USSR, and given the weakness of ethno-nationalism in Belarus, Are we not in the situation where we, as Belarusians, inhabit this Soviet discourse, which we can call colonial, but in the context where the determinant, the one who controls this discourse, it no longer exists, and the determinant ceased to exist, and now we inhabit this hollow discourse, and Belarus appears to be this heir of the Soviet Union that is long gone, but we continue to live within this framework. Grigory, would you like to take on this?
It was a long, very worded question, so I'm not sure that I understood all intricacies.
I can repeat the question. Yeah.
Let me start talking, and then you will correct me if I'm entirely off the wall. If I'm just Sasha just made a comment that I like or dislike some adjective. It's not that I like or dislike them. I am just against imposing externally some kind of imperatives in the forms of cliches that are not congruent with what people that we're talking about think. It reminds me about one discussion that we had in, several years ago in Washington, D.C. at the Jamestown Foundation, and a guy who was who is now a kind of a prime minister at Mrs. Tikhanovskaya court. I think his name is Kovalevsky. He was present, and he seems to have completely misinterpreted what I said about the Belarusian language, and he mentioned something that to the effect that I demean it, that I despise it, to which I responded that Belarusian is no worse and no better than any other language. And I personally have no problem reading Belarusian. Unfortunately, some Belarusians do. That's why on the website of the Belarusian Service of Radio Liberty, in the right upper corner, you have a possibility of translating the entire text into Russian. And although this translation is not always perfect, quite a few people resort to it because they feel comfortable. And those people are much more Belarusian in terms of their background than I am. I never switch to Russian. I read it in the original, but many of them do. Likewise, this idea of Belarus being an heir or inheriting much of the Soviet experience. Indeed, it is inheriting much of the Soviet experience for the reason that I outlined in the very beginning, because it was the formative period in Belarusians' identity formation. It was the longest period of their self-conscious existence. And so with this in mind, of course, we cannot erase that period. But to say that Belarus of today can be reduced to just something Soviet, which is like a vestige of the past, I think it would be an exaggeration. Belarus of today is what it is. There are two different historical narratives. There are two versions of historical memory. And there is a deep chasm between these two groups of people. One of these groups, or probably each of these groups, tends to belittle the scale, the magnitude of the other, and there are no bridges between the two. And the events that began with the 9th of August 2020 elections only made this chasm bigger, which is, I think, the most crucial problem that Belarusians face, the problem of national consolidation. But to say that Belarus is just a figment of, it's just a sort of a case study or one of those smithereens into which the entire kind of a porcelain China, the Soviet Union, when it broke up, and so we have this distilled Soviet experience and only one post-Soviet country, which is Belarus. I think it's an exaggeration. Belarus certainly is a country of its own. It is unique. It lacks national consolidation, but it has so many other, aside from the Soviet period, no matter how important it is, it has many other sources of inspiration. And it seems like, in view of the fact that language is not going to unite Belarus, it's as Sasha just said when she speaks Belarusian, she just underscores her closeness to a certain group of people and nothing more than that. Because language is not going to unite Belarusians anytime soon. It's the notion of civic nationalism that probably is going to be the guiding principle of further crystallizing crystallization, or however you put it, of Belarusian identity. So yes, the Soviet experience once again was very important. You cannot erase it. You cannot pretend that it didn't happen. You cannot say that it was entirely a colonial period, just because most Belarusians do not perceive it as such. Only some do. But it's the path of civic nationalism, the only viable and tangible path that can really be followed or pursued by all those who are interested in further development of Belarusian identity. Well, I guess since you didn't interrupt me, probably I was responding to your question.
Well, yes, probably if I can pick up from what Grigory has just said.
Please.
Well, I think, well, I understand on the one hand, I understand your questions and how you're trying to provoke us and well, all this conversation. But of course, well, sometimes there's, I've seen attempts to present what began in Belarus in the summer of 2020 as this national, anti-national issue for the language, against the language, national culture, against the national culture. Of course, there's a certain national component, national cultural component in what is going on, as Sasha has been able to demonstrate, for example, when she writes, when she speaks about this Belarusian protest art, and she demonstrates its relationship with some ethnic folk cultural patterns, etc. But these the events in Belarus are not about that. The struggle, what is going on, is not about this language. This language is the national language, or that language is now the national language. It is about something else. It's about the relationship between the polity and the rulers, the government. People want to take participation, to participate in making political decisions. People want to be recognized as political subjects. People want to have a say. Well, at this point, people just want to have some security and very basic rights. For we know that these days people are just stopped in the streets of Minsk and searched, and well, their phones are searched. As soon as they are stopped, they need to provide the well, passcode or whatever it is, the passcode to their phones, and their phones are searched, and their emails and their etc. Well, this is unacceptable, and this is definitely about political agency. This is definitely about rights. This is about what the government can or cannot do, and it seems that these days the government can do absolutely anything. There's no stopping point. And the issue of language and culture, well, they contribute to how protest is expressed for a protest takes a certain form. But definitely, this is not about, well, it's not the way it was in Ukraine, for example, which was a much more during the Maidan, which was a much more, well, nationally colored revolution. Belarusian is a civic revolution. It has some of those national cultural element, but this is about citizenship and agency and rights.
Absolutely.
As you brought up now the example of Ukraine, a lot of texts that were appearing as the event started initially, they were attempting to compare the situation in Belarus to the Ukrainian situation. But what appears to me is that in Ukraine, the events were marked much more significantly by retrospective activization of sources of national identity, the rediscovery of their own language, the getting rid of the Soviet memorials, Lenin statues, and stuff like that. But in Belarus, we don't see the same processes. And I was wondering if it is connected with the reason that the meaning of the Soviet has been reappropriated in Belarus, that it does not carry the same oppressive connotation as it is for Ukraine. Maybe Sasha, you would like to comment on this?
Yes, thank you. So I probably would disagree that Belarus didn't have its own ethnic narratives in circulation, but if we are to look at the protest corpus and its particular rituals, the area in which Belarusians, ethnic Belarusians, manifested itself the most is in music, in the work of the Volyny Khor and in the work of Serjuk Dougushov Traditsiya band, where he published these beautiful songbooks, and the corpus is predominantly Belarusian. It's all Belarusian songs, one Polish, one Russian. This is it. But the reason why this happened is because this is what happens in heritage cultures. The music is the last to die. The songs are the ones that stayed with us. It also happened because there was an existing infrastructure already there in Belarus, and someone like Dougushov has been working with this for a long time already and could mobilize quickly. If we are to look at the monuments and the fate of the monuments, we see a completely different dynamic. Not one Lenin statue fell, and in fact, if you are to talk to the younger generations of Belarusians, they feel very sentimental about the Soviet time mosaics and murals, monumental works. And from what I heard in our art community, people are against the senseless destruction and would love to preserve it as a historic memory. I was also recently commenting on a paper written by American historian Steve Norris, in which Steve tried to draw out the narrative of World War II and connect the recent protests to the World War II heritage in Belarus, saying that, well, if this informed Belarusian identity the most, does it mean that the protesters are using it? And I had to point out to him that different age groups react completely differently to the war narratives. And it's true that the senior citizens' marches picked up the song titled The Sacred War and performed it. But for the younger generation, it is not so obvious. And up to this point, I only found one example of a very young artist who is in her early 20s, Tasha Katsuba, creating protest costumes and photographing herself against the backdrop of the Soviet statues. So again, here the processes are not obvious. So to summarize my argument, in comparison to Ukraine, the ethnic identity is weaker, and decommunization is not a narrative, at least yet. Yet there are some powerful processes of cultural revitalization that were ignited by the protests that we can no longer ignore or underscore in our discussions as well.
Would you, Sasha, agree then that the Russian agency appears precisely not through the denial of the old colonial heritage, but through the articulation of our own identity, through the self-awareness already within the framework of existing historical and cultural narratives, as something that you do, for example, in your work with Vyzhyvanka?
So it is exactly that self-awareness, also fluidity of these identities, also sometimes concurrent strands manifesting itself in parallel to each other or concurrently. There is not one definitive answer to that. And looking closely at the protest corpus and the protest rituals, I was able to uncover many different strains that coexist. For example, if we are to talk about embroidery and protest embroidery, we know that the Belarusians during the Soviet period was largely constructed in association with women like kolkhozniцы, embroidering the portraits of Stalin. So the very idea of political embroidery is something that was invented during the BSSR, and the same thing existed in Ukraine. Fast forward 100 years later, and what we have in Ukraine is a strong, like very strong element of ethnic wear with vyshyvanka, whereas in this protest, we see a lot of artist embroideries, and some definitely articulate more leftist narratives than the other. For example, there is a wonderful German Belarusian artist, Marina Naprushkina, who embroidered against the backdrop of Soviet notebooks, школьные тетрадки, and she did a wonderful work juxtaposing the blueprints of her father, who was a Soviet architect, up against this embroidery. And she did embroider in Belarusian, even though she's a Russophone person. At the same time, we do have someone like a Seattle-based artist, musician Volya Demko, who engages in very detailed historical reconstructions of this is how the ethnic wear looked like in the 19th century. And this is her narrative as well. So I think we shouldn't be so stuck on the national, post-national cliches. They are not in opposition to each other, but look for other narratives. What about social solidarity? What about feminism? What about memory formation? What about how we are going to deal with trauma? And all these things are just as important in this situation. Thank you.
Elena or Grigory, do you have anything to say in this?
Okay, thank you, Grigory. Well, I was just thinking that, well, trying to compare Belarus and Ukraine, it would make sense to look at the social structure, at the development of the IT sector in Belarus. And the Belarusian protests have been driven, they are mostly Russian speaking, and then they are driven by ITshniks, by people in the IT industry largely. They are driven by the educated urban middle class. But at the same time, at least in the first weeks after the election, thousands of people from Belarusian industrial giants participated in protests. Their participation was in part a reaction to the state violence, to the horrendous state violence during the first week. But still, these industrial giants, which were initially created still during the Soviet period, they survived in Belarus largely due to the government effort to keep them functioning. Of course, most of them work for the Russian market, but they still exist. So while in the Ukraine, I think few of them survived this post-Soviet period. So I think the social structure, class structure of society is somewhat different in Belarus and Ukraine, and we cannot overlook this reason. It really matters who the people are and how. And besides, in Ukraine, they have this, well, from as I know from reading about Ukraine, they have these powerful and unbelievably rich oligarchs. In Belarus, income inequality is much smaller. There are reasons for that, and this is a whole special conversation, but we do not see this enormous income inequality. And this is a factor, definitely. It matters. Please, Grigory.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing that, calling for Belarusian Ukrainian comparisons, on the one hand, may be entirely justified and justifiable. On the other hand, it is slightly misleading because if the only conclusion that we would draw from this comparison that Ukrainian national identity is stronger. It doesn't sound quite convincing to me for a simple reason that Ukraine is a divided country. It's in a way even more divided than Belarus because its division has a very clear-cut spatial expression. Because in Belarus, there is also division, but it's more like Minsk versus the rest of the country. There is no equivalent to Ukrainian Galicia. You know, Grodno Oblast might be such an equivalent, but it's not. Also, yeah, Elena is absolutely correct. The Ukrainian oligarchs' enormous polarization of incomes, this is something that Belarus doesn't have, and it is for the better. Also, you know, this, you know, some people really, you know, it's their pastime just comparing with Ukraine in order to extol how independent Ukraine is, which I think is short-sighted. First of all, don't forget that unlike Belarus that had its census relatively recently, Ukraine hasn't had census since 2001. Nobody knows exactly how many people are left there. And deindustrialization of Ukraine actually had some tragic consequences. And this tragic consequence is humongous out-migration. Initially in favor of Russia, then in favor of Poland. But you know, the fact that Belarus hasn't suffered from that to the extent Ukraine has. I know, you know, quite a few people have left Belarus since the 9th of August, but it pales in comparison. Ukraine, whatever happened in Ukraine dwarfs from the, you know, what is going on in Belarus. And once again, Ukraine is there is a stark geographical divide. It's a culturally divided country. Therefore, claiming that Ukrainian identity is stronger, period, it just doesn't ring a bell. What kind of Ukrainian identity? The one which is, what's the name of this former boss of the Institute of National Memory?
Vetrovich.
Yeah, Vetrovich, you know, yeah. Nobody's identity is as strong as Petrovich's is, but is it for the better or for the worse? You know, I think it's for the better. Well, anyway, that's all I wanted to add.
Okay, thank you. And now I want to talk a little bit quickly about Russia, and now as we talk about the Russian agency that we decide and declare our own future, and the process that started to redefine the relations and imperial ambitions of Russia to Belarus. Do you agree that the appearance of autonomous Belarusian agent makes us view the threat of Russian imperialism not as manifestation of long-standing structures, these old structures, but as actual and new and conceptually new, like, for example, the formation of huge infrastructures of dependence, for example, Astrovets nuclear power plant, which is Russia-sponsored. Would someone like to take up on this? Sasha,
the question is initially about the way that Russia interferes in Belarusian affairs, whether it is conceptually new or not. And my answer is very short. If you are going to be eaten, does it matter to you if you're eaten by a very ancient form of wildlife, or is it a new cool species that consumed you? To me, it doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter after I die whether I have inscription in Russian or Belarusian on my grave. But what we're experiencing right now is rather serious. And there is a lot of decolonization that needs to be done in the discourse, in interactions with our Russian colleagues. Because I think that the Belarusian subject only started understanding itself in connection to the increased volume of attention to the country. And in this discussion, and in the interactions with other bodies, this is how our own narratives resurface, and this is how we understand who we are. Because first something rubs me the wrong way, that I need to do a lot of reflecting, like, why is it this way? Why do I feel about this as something more complicated? And then the ideas begin to circulate. So it's a loaded question. I'm not a political analyst, but what we're experiencing right now is rather serious, and the graveness of the situation should not be underestimated.
Yes, thank you. I agree with you, because what I see a lot of times is that this danger is often dismissed because it's viewed as something that has been there for a long time, and then as if it is nothing serious, as if it has been present for a long time, and it means that it's just manifestation of this old structures that are not new. But then again, we are facing something conceptually new, I would say. Maybe Elena or Grigory, you want to say anything?
Well, just my 2 cents. Well, on the one hand, we understand this political danger of Russian support for Lukashenko and interference and all that. On the other hand, I think that having an atomic power station is a great thing for Belarus. Atomic power stations are everywhere these days, and people need power and energy. And unless all power is substituted by this power from the renewable sources, atomic power stations, if they're safe, are a temporary solution. So, but on the other hand, Belarus is a smaller nation, and as I look at Central Europe, at Eastern Europe, at post-Soviet nations, I can see that smaller nations, they have to align with someone, and that's the reality of the political world. These days. Of course, it would be great if Belarus were able to have this what they call these days, this multi-vector policy. But when I look at Central European nations, I can see that, few, if any of them, have any multi-vector policy. They align with certain bigger powers. And then just a very brief comment on this discussion of languages. There are smaller languages and there are global languages. And I participated in a conference once in Edinburgh. And the conference was about, and Edinburgh, of course, is in Scotland, and it was about this discussion of all those Scottish languages that the more nationally oriented Scottish citizens try to promote. And the title of the conference, it was a very witty title. It was called In the Shadow of Global Languages. So definitely Belarusian, as ancient as it is and as developed as it is now, is a small language. And Russian, which most Belarusians, all Belarusians know and understand, is a global language, which means that it is a language of access to global culture, whether we like it or not. Now I know that a lot of translation work is being done by Belarusian poets and writers trying to translate great works of art into Belarusian. But still, we are a smaller nation, and definitely those who do not read English and Spanish and German and French and all other languages, they access world culture with the help of the Russian language. So I think that, this conversation about whether Russian or Belarusian, this conversation needs to be reframed somehow. It needs to be the questions that we try to answer probably should be worded somewhat differently. The Russian language is a reality, and it is also a reality of access to global culture and global science, and it is important.
Thank you very much for this comment. And yes, Grigory?
Yeah, because you asked all three of us to add something, and I'm kind of stumped for, but I liked what Sasha said about her indifference as to in which language the inscription on her grave is going to be. You know, I guess I'm going to be cremated, and so I will sort of resolve this question in such a way. So, and Sasha also said that if you're going to be eaten up, it just doesn't matter by whom. I would enthusiastically agree with this statement, but to me, what is going to happen to Belarus, or what is not going to happen in Belarus, to some extent, has a connection with how the West sees Belarus. For example, the most recent events in the Belarusian-American relations have been kind of peculiar when the ambassador that was appointed to represent the United States in Minsk decided to stay in Vilnius because, you know, from the moral standpoint, it seems to her that whoever is in Vilnius is actually more appropriate than whoever is in Minsk. It was a very peculiar and weird attitude, and it is, because this particular attitude, while people that embrace this attitude express concerns about Belarus becoming more and more dependent on Russia, what they are doing, they're actually facilitating precisely this outcome. You've got to recognize that certain people are in command in Minsk. And you've got to understand that it is their vested interest to stay independent, for better or worse, because they just don't want to become a provincial elite somewhere, you know, in one of Russian oblasts. And so you need to recognize and even respect that, with all, despite your you know, sympathy with the opposite side of the barricade. So if the West looks and sees Belarus for what it is, how divided it is, and how the lack of consolidation is the most important problem in Belarus, then it's not going to be eaten up. But if it sides with just one side of the political barricades, under the assumption that the situation that is now in Belarus is untenable and it's unsustainable, then it's gonna end up in precisely the way nobody wants. And I just hope that Belarus is gonna stay independent. And there are all sorts of reasons to believe that this is going to be the case. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I definitely hope so too. And we have all the reasons to believe so. And I think this is a good point to end the discussion. I would like to thank all of you for the participation. I would like to thank Elena Gapova, Sasha Razor, and Grigory Ioffe for your engagement and very valuable contributions. This conversation was over the top. We've covered so much. And thank you, everybody who's watching it on YouTube. And if you want to say anything at the end, any remark, any last comment, please go ahead.
Well, thank you for bringing us. Thank you for bringing us together.
Yeah, thank you.
It was my pleasure. I really much enjoyed it. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you all.
Okay,
That was a
we
good
can end
conversation.
here. Thank you.